I was a good white person. I was a do-gooder.
To be white in this country is to be encapsulated in this social milieu, this realm that not only allows denial of the issue of racism, but really mandates denial.
I empathized with people of color. I understood the history.
What gets hidden is our fear. What gets hidden is our guilt.
This country was built on the backs of indigenous peoples, on the backs of slaves, and on the backs of Chinese immigrant labor. And we see the same pattern continuing today.
I have to know this history because this history is within me.
The shame is too deep to look at. Please don't make me look at this.
We talk about it as something that happened in the past.
Everyone said we don't have a race problem in America anymore. And it festered into the LA riots. And then everyone said, oh, maybe we do have a race problem.
Walking down the street, walking in a bank, going to look for a house, buy a car. I got the mask of whiteness. The advantage is always there.
We mean well, and yet we don't believe that we have any more work to do on ourselves. We cease looking at ourselves. But Audre Lorde talks about it as the painful and necessary experience of excavating the truth about racism.
When I'm walking down the street, I like to smile at black people, don't you? That warm, cuddly, puppies and babies smile. To let them know I'm friendly, guilty, sorry. It's all been a really bad joke, huh? I'm nervous, I'm angry. Not at you, but me. But you remind me that I hurt you, and now I hurt too, and that you will never be sorry for me.
A lot of times when folks hear you grew up in California, they think, oh, California is very diverse, but I've found it's also very segregated. So even though I was in a town that had quite a bit of diversity, it was not anything that I was aware of.
The politics of the town, pretty conservative. I guess you can see it most when you watch the 4th of July parades. Confederate flags will appear in the Boy Scout troops.
I never saw African-American people. They lived in a different part of town. They rode a different bus. They went to different schools. The only time I ever saw anybody of color was when we went over to St. Paul's West Side to buy shoes. And we would go past Our Lady of Lourdes and look inside, and of course it looked much different from the church that we went to.
I grew up in a household hearing racial slurs where my mom would correct my father and say, we don't, that's not a nice thing to say, about those people. My father had actually been very close with an Asian American family. Their family was interned during World War II, and my father had helped to protect his house along with a lot of other friends. But still, I heard comments about, the Japs.
My parents spoke oftentimes in racist ways. They used the N-word often. When I was young, I really didn't know what that meant. But I sort of got that I was supposed to stay away from people of color, particularly black people. That they were going to take something from me, they were going to hurt me in some way.
My family's history goes back to Governor Randolph of Virginia. My father's family goes back to John Quincy Adams. There's a very distant link to Thomas Jefferson. I know my family's history. I know that my family owned slaves. We used to spend summers down at the plantation house in Wilmington, and we used to play in the slave quarters.
My first exposure to what I think of as outright racism came from my grandmother when I was perhaps 6, 7, or 8. We had driven to visit her in Pennsylvania, and at the end of our visit, I ran into the kitchen to kiss my grandmother's cook, Bessie, goodbye.
Give me some sugar.
I loved Bessie. Then I ran into the parlor and kissed my grandmother goodbye. And she shrieked at me in a voice I had never heard before. And she said, "I bet you kissed me with the same little old lip you kissed Bessie." I never touched Bessie again.
I had some adopted cousins on my dad's side, and 2 of them were African American, and the rest of my cousins were white. I didn't necessarily know the significance of that until actually when I moved to Texas, and one of my cousins came to visit us, and one of my girlfriends was extremely uncomfortable around my cousin. And I started to realize the power of silence. I just remember feeling the conflict of wanting acceptance and wanting truth. Wanting to be proud of my love for my black cousins, and still wanting friends, and feeling scared that I would lose my friends if I was open about my love for my cousins.
My father basically raised me from about when I was about 4 or 5. Things sort of started out normal. They're trying to have a family and a house. And then my mother was hospitalized when I was 4 or 5. They didn't talk about what was going on or whatever, but she was in a mental hospital. She was at County General, Los Angeles. That's where she met the man who became my stepfather, who was black, and he was in the mental ward as well. The story on him was that he was a returning prisoner of war from Korea, and that he had been tortured. He was the most hopeful person in my life growing up, because he was warm and told great stories. And that was the only real feeling I ever had of family, was when he and my half-brother and my mother were together. And that was a place where I could go when I was welcome. My father was pretty upset about being dumped for a black mental patient, which is essentially what happened. So I got to listen to him spew, racism about that a lot. I was very aware from age 6 that the world had to change for my family to stay together, because I could tell just walking down the street that same street, 2 different days, people looked differently at my mother and all of us at our family when my stepfather was in the picture as when he wasn't in the picture.
I was born in Thailand, and I was raised in Thailand and Argentina. And then we came to the U.S. when I was 4, and I grew up on a dairy farm, my father's family dairy farm in western New York, which is predominantly a white area. And so that was very jarring, I think is the word, coming from countries that were predominantly people of color and people that I connected very deeply with, and then coming back to the U.S. One incident that I had when I was growing up, I think I was about 7. I was in the backwoods with a group of boys. I don't remember it entirely clearly, but I do remember what happened there. They were standing around talking, and they used various racial epithets and talked about women, and then I was assaulted, and there was, all the elements were there, and I think it was just a profoundly life-changing